I want to set the scene. City streets silent, shops shuttered, church doors locked, citizens ordered to cover their faces before stepping outside. Police patrols fine anyone who disobeys. Hospitals overflow, funerals are limited, travel halted, schools closed indefinitely. Newspapers warn of contagion, then of disinformation. Public officials insist the measures are temporary, that obedience is patriotic, that dissent endangers lives. Does this sound familiar? Well, if you thought I just described the COVID-19 pandemic, you'd be wrong. What I just described was the Spanish flu of 1918. Pause for a moment. Let that sink in. A century apart, yet the story feels the same. The same orders, the same slogans, the same public tone of certainty. It's as if someone kept the notes, then pressed play again. You're listening to the Luminary Room, and this is episode 12, Copy, Paste, Control, how the 1918 Spanish flu became the playbook for COVID-19. I'm Nico, the voice behind 369 Lumineer, and today we're investigating how the playbook from 1918 was quietly reused in 2020. How masking, censorship and fear became tools not just of protection, but of control. Today's Illumination session asks a single unsettling question. What happens when the lessons from one crisis become the operating manual for the next? Who wrote that manual? Who benefits when we obey without asking why? Well, here's a quick roadmap of what we're going to go through. First, we'll walk the streets of 1918 and name the measures that reshaped daily life. Then we'll move forward a century and map the same measures in 2020 to 2021. We'll talk psychology and the mechanics of obedience. We'll name institutions and actors who bridged the two eras. And finally, we'll ask the hard questions most people avoid. Was what happened in 2020 a spontaneous reaction to a new threat, or a carbon copy of a playbook tested in 1918? So let's begin with part one of the playbook, 1918. San Francisco offers a clear, almost cinematic window into how public health and civic power first learned to manage mass behaviour. When the influenza battered the city, leaders required masks for anyone in public and for many working professions. Compliance started high and then frayed. Citizens who refused masks were fined or even jailed. Organised resistance emerged as the Anti-Mask League, a mass meeting where thousands protested mandatory masking, and the city eventually repealed the order. This rise and fall of compliance is neither exotic nor isolated. It happened in other cities too, and it taught the authorities something crucial. You can mandate behaviour, you can punish non-compliance, but without legitimacy, that mandate collapses into chaos. Science in 1918 existed alongside powerful private institutions that funded research and cultivated influence. The Rockefeller Institute played a significant role in early bacteriology and vaccine research during the era surrounding the pandemic, and its labs were among those attempting to understand and respond to the crisis. Those institutes shaped both knowledge and the institutional networks that would later become central to global public health infrastructure. Politics in wartime changed how information moved. The Wilson administration created the Committee on Public Information to marshal public sentiment and shape media narratives during World War I. The mechanisms and habits of wartime communication, which were censorship of dissent, patriotic messaging, suppression of inconvenient questions, did not disappear with the armistice. They became a template for how governments manage messages in moments of existential threat. So what was the takeaway from 1918? Mask mandates, curfews, closures, fines and public campaigns were not only epidemiological tools, they were social instruments that taught citizens how to behave under stress. They created precedents about who speaks, who decides, and which institutions count as authority. Now, here's part two of this playbook. Let's now fast forward to late 2019, early 2020, and this new virus that radiated around the world. Literally within months, mask guidance, curfews, travel restrictions, and a cascade of public health orders reshaped behaviour globally. Institutions familiar to historians of public health led the response. The World Health Organization, the supposed arbiter of global health control, issued emergency declarations and technical advice that national governments used to justify domestic measures. Social media platforms moderated content, and governments leaned on public messaging to enforce compliance. If you trace the sequence, the similarities are striking. The tools were updated, but the architecture looks familiar. And we must name a few of the modern anchors. Public health officials like Anthony Fauci became the face of technical authority, urging mask use, and stepped into public debates about individual liberty versus collective risk. International organisations curated guidelines, and member governments invoked those guidelines when they closed borders and limited travel. Technology companies deployed moderation policies that flagged and sometimes removed content deemed false or dangerous, or they leaned on terms mis and disinformation. Fact checkers was a thriving industry. Those moves shaped what millions saw and heard, and therefore how they behaved. So why does a playbook repeat? Human behaviour has patterns. When fear rises, people seek clarity and someone to tell them what to do. Authority offers certainty. Rules reduce cognitive load. Masks, curfews and bans create a visible ritual of compliance. A society under threat shifts towards obeying visible rules even when those rules conflict with private instincts. Leaders learn this, and institutions learn how to exploit it. Take Melbourne in Australia, for example. For more than 2 years, it held the title of the most lockdown city on earth. 6 separate lockdowns, hundreds of days under curfew, travel limits that split families apart, police checkpoints on suburban roads, a city transformed into a live experiment in behavioural endurance. Local and state leaders justified the measures as necessary to flatten the curve. We've all heard that. But to many observers, Melbourne became something else, a global test site for how far democratic societies would comply when fear and authority worked in tandem. People queued for hours to prove compliance, not defiance. The messaging, the surveillance, the public shaming of dissent, it all fit neatly into the same behavioural playbook written a century earlier. Now ask yourself, is compliance only a byproduct of good faith public health? Or does the structure of emergency governance itself create incentives for preserving authority long after the crisis fades? Now, institutions do not appear in isolation. They inherit networks, money and relationships from prior eras. Foundations, universities and research labs that were active in 1918 evolved into powerful funders and advisors across the 20th century. The Rockefeller Foundation and the Pasteur Institute once focused on regional disease control. They became global players shaping how health policy was funded, framed and enforced. Those relationships mattered. When the next pandemic came, channels of influence already existed between researchers, funders, public health agencies and the media ecosystem. This is not a claim that any single actor centrally orchestrated both events. This is a claim about continuity, about how structures remain and how lessons in governance and communication travel through institutions over decades. My core thesis is this. What governments and the ruling class did in 2020 was not purely novel. They reached for a tested playbook of behavioural management that matured in 1918. Masking mandates, censorship of dissenting narratives, the use of emergency legal powers, travel restrictions, and the social engineering of compliance were rehearsed models that resurfaced in a modern guise. I cannot verify this as a centralised intentional conspiracy, but the parallels in tools and institutional actors demand scrutiny and explanation. So, let's quickly map the specific parallel. Masks. In 1918, entire cities imposed cloth masks and enforced them with fines and social pressure. Resistance intensified when leaders violated the rules or when enforcement appeared inconsistent. In 2020, masks reappeared globally, this time with debates about cloth versus medical masks, mandates by local and national authorities, and huge cultural fights over their symbolism. Now, compare the two and you find the same mechanism. Visible authority prescribes visible behaviour, and absence of consistent legitimacy produces resistance. And what about censorship and message control? Well, in 1917 to 18 wartime, censorship normalised editing of public information and patriotic narratives. Governments learned to bury certain facts and amplify others in moments of national crisis. A century later, new censorship tools appear in digital form. Platforms added warnings, removed posts, and throttled accounts. Public health bureaus sometimes labelled alternative views as misinformation. Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of Facebook and Instagram, stated in a letter, and this is verbatim, that senior officials from the Biden administration, including the White House, repeatedly pressured our teams for months to censor certain COVID-19 content. Now, the letter also notes that while Meta, at the time, made the removal decisions themselves, Zuckerberg believed the government pressure was wrong, they're his words, and he regrets that we were not more outspoken about it. On Twitter, new CEO Elon Musk ended the platform's COVID misinformation policy 3 weeks after taking ownership, after the previous regime, headed by then far-left and woke technocrat Jack Dorsey, had conspired with the Biden administration to silence users, which had resulted in significant content removal and account suspensions. The effect is similar: a narrowing of permitted public discourse, created by different tools, different scale, but analogous logic. And what about travel and border control? Well, 1918 saw localities close borders and restrict movement to attempt to slow spread. In 2020, whole nations closed borders, airlines changed routes, and travel advice became a key lever of policy. The difference is technological, the scale is global, but the governing calculus is the same: restrict movement to control transmission, and I use those words lightly, and legitimise extraordinary powers. And how about pharma and profit? In 1918, research involved institutions like the Rockefeller Institute and others who were central to early interventions, as I mentioned earlier. Those same institutional lineages, over time, became core to the modern biomedical complex that interacts with government during emergencies. When a pandemic brings new treatments and vaccines, those institutions, including the CDC, the WHO, the UN, stand at the intersection of policy, funding, and public messaging. That proximity creates incentives and perceptions about who benefits and who decides. Every emergency measure asks citizens to accept a trade-off: freedom for protection. That trade-off relies on trust. If citizens see inconsistent rules or suspect hidden motives, trust erodes. And once trust erodes, compliance becomes fragile. This is a crucial lesson that both 1918 and 2020 teach us. Ruling institutions observe what works and what fails. They archive strategies that achieve compliance with minimal unrest. Public health measures that succeed become part of the institutional memory. That memory influences training, playbooks, legal frameworks, and public relations strategies. So when a new crisis appears, policymakers don't start from first principles. They start from the folders labelled past responses. They ask which templates scaled and which did not. So, what are the dangers of unexamined repetition? When the past becomes a template uncritically adopted, we risk repeating not only the effective tactics, but also the old mistakes. Masks enforced without transparent criteria breed resentment. Censorship without independent review fosters distrust. Emergency powers used without sunset clauses expand authority over time. We should learn the technical lessons from past pandemics, but also interrogate the ethical and political choices embedded within them. Think back to those first few months of 2020. Your local government moved fast. New rules, new experts, new slogans. But pause for a moment. Who gave them the scientific justification for those moves? Who funded the research behind the recommendations that shaped your life? And when voices disagreed, who was amplified and who was quietly silenced? Now hold those facts and answer these. Did the playbook reduce harm overall, or did it concentrate power in ways we should now resist? If you believe public health matters, ask yourself how to protect it while also preserving democratic oversight. So, what should we demand now? We should demand transparency about who funds what. We should demand independent oversight of emergency powers with strict sunset clauses. We should demand a public record of the scientific basis for specific measures and the data used to justify them. We should demand pluralism in public discourse so that dissenting evidence is heard, tested and refuted publicly, not suppressed privately. This program does not insist on a single narrative. It insists on the right to ask. It insists we examine patterns, not just outcomes. It insists that we insist on accountability and on the preservation of civic trust. Now ask yourself this. If a century of public health practice produced a playbook, what role will you accept the next time it's rolled out? Will you assume novelty and obey? Or will you examine origins, ask for proof, and hold institutions to account? I know what I'd do, the same thing I did before when they told me not to. You've just experienced another illumination session in the Luminary Room. If today's episode shed light on how power writes the story of public health, subscribe, share, and help spread that light further. Each listener helps reveal how control begins with the story we're told. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and stay aware. This is 369 Lumineer, signing off.